GDPR requires any organization processing personal data to have a valid legal basis for that processing activity. And the law provides 6 legal bases for processing: consent, the performance of a contract, a legitimate interest, a vital interest, a legal requirement, and a public interest. First, most organizations ask, do they have to have consent to process data? And the answer is not necessarily. As I mentioned, consent is just one of 6 legal grounds for processing data. If you do use consent, you should know that consent must be freely given, clear, and it must be as easy to withdraw consent as it is to give consent. Legitimate interest is, for example, something like a marketing activity. That's a processing activity that a data subject would normally expect an organization that it gives its personal data to do. However, if an organization uses legitimate interest as its valid legal basis for processing, it has to perform a balancing test. Is the processing activity necessary in order for the organization to function? And is the processing activity outweigh any objection or risks to a data subject's rights and freedoms? Contract is pretty self-explanatory. Public interest is a processing activity that would occur by a government entity or an organization acting on behalf of a government entity. A vital interest would be a rare occasion where processing is required, for example, to save someone's life. The reason that legal basis for processing is so important is that the legal basis must be demonstrable at all times. So an organization must be able to show internally and to data subjects and to regulatory entities what legal basis it uses for each individual whose data it processes. If a data subject gives its consent to an organization, the organization must be able to demonstrate that when and how that data subject gave consent. Because consent must be freely given, organizations can no longer use automatically checked boxes to demonstrate that a data subject gave their consent for the organization to use their data. The consent process must be clear, and sometimes it must be separate. For example, if an organization is going to use email to send marketing messages to a data subject, an organization might choose to have a separate box for email than it does for other written forms of communication or text messages or phone calls. A legal basis for processing is also important because it has a significant impact on the way an organization responds to data subject rights requests. There are some rights that may be granted if consent is the legal basis for processing, or if performance of a contract is the basis for processing. There are other implications for legal basis as well. For example, the processing of special categories of data, which includes race, ethnicity, healthcare data, biometric data, among other sensitive pieces of information, requires certain legal basis for processing. Another challenge with the legal basis for processing is if an organization uses multiple legal bases to process different data sets. For example, an organization might process the personal data of EU data subjects who are employees of the organization and also of customers who it's selling goods or services to and is also marketing to. The legal basis for processing employee data may be different than the legal basis for processing customer data. An organization should make sure that they can distinguish between which legal basis is being used for processing to ensure that they respond correctly to data subject rights and to ensure that they perform any balancing tests related to legitimate interest. Finally, it should be noted that organizations can't select which legal basis they're using to process data and then later change the legal basis if they use both consent and contract. There must be only one legal basis for processing at a time. It should be noted that no specific legal basis for processing is necessarily better than any of the other legal bases for processing. The most effective legal basis for processing depends on the purpose of processing and an organization's relationship with the data subject. Having said that, the legal basis for processing must be clearly established before the processing activities begin. Organizations cannot go after the fact and try to obtain consent or execute a contract to demonstrate that they have a legal basis for processing.